I never expected to find myself where I am today. At 28, I own my own home, run a successful business, and finally feel at peace. But the road here? That's a story I've never fully shared until now. Let me start from the beginning. I'm Jake, and I have a twin sister, Emma. We were born on a crisp autumn morning in Minneapolis, but that's where the twin part of our story pretty much ends. From day one, it was clear who the favorite was, and it wasn't me. We only planned for one. My mom would casually mention at family gatherings, glancing at Emma with adoration while I pretended not to hear. Emma was our miracle baby. Jake was, well, a surprise. They didn't even try to hide it, which somehow made it worse. It's one thing to suspect you're unwanted. It's another to have it confirmed over Sunday dinner. Growing up, the contrast between our lives was like night and day. Emma's room was a Pinterest-worthy showcase of everything a kid could want. Fairy lights twinkling above her canopy bed, shelves lined with the latest toys, and a walk-in closet bursting with new clothes. Meanwhile, my room, well, calling it a room was generous. It was more like a glorified closet, with a bed crammed inside, the springs squeaking with every breath I took. Every morning was the same routine. I'd wake up to the sound of my parents fawning over Emma's latest achievement. "Did you see Emma's art project? She's so talented!" Or "Emma's dance recital is coming up. We need to get her new shoes." I'd sit at the breakfast table, pushing my cereal around while they planned her day, her week, and her future. Sometimes I wondered if they'd even notice if I just didn't show up one morning. School wasn't any better. Parent-teacher conferences were like watching a one-act play where I was just an extra in Emma's story. My straight A's gathered dust while they cooed over her C+ in art class. "She's so creative," they'd gush, while my report card sat unopened. I kept pushing myself, thinking maybe if I just did better and worked harder, they'd finally see me. But you can't force people to see what they're determined to ignore. The only person who ever really saw me was my grandfather, Marcus. He was this gruff old Marine with hands like baseball mitts and a heart of gold. Every Saturday he'd pick me up in his beaten-up Ford pickup, and we'd head to the lake. Those were the only times I felt like I could breathe. "You're made of stronger stuff than they know, kid," he'd tell me while teaching me how to bait a hook or fix an engine. "Sometimes the best people come from the worst situations." I didn't really understand what he meant back then, but those words would end up being my lifeline in the years to come. For a few hours each weekend, I wasn't the unwanted twin or the family disappointment. I was just Jake, learning how to change oil, fix carburetors, and catch bass. Grandpa Marcus had this way of making me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just taking up space in someone else's story. But life has a way of taking even the good things from you. When I was 14, Grandpa Marcus got diagnosed with lung cancer, stage 4. It was like watching a mountain crumble. Even then, my parents managed to make it about Emma, how hard it was for her, how she needed extra support during this difficult time. Meanwhile, I had to sneak out to visit him in the hospital, climbing through the window of his room after visiting hours because they wouldn't take me during the day. The last time I saw him, he grabbed my hand with what strength he had left. "You're going to make it," he whispered. "You're going to prove them all wrong." A week later, he was gone, and with him, the only person who had ever really been in my corner. I remember standing at his funeral, shoved to the back, while Emma stood front and center with my parents, accepting condolences like she was the only one who'd lost someone. I watched them comfort her and wipe her tears while I stood alone, my own grief pushed aside like everything else in my life. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Life was about to get a whole lot harder, and the lessons Grandpa Marcus taught me about strength, I was going to need every single one of them. Looking back now, I wish I could tell that lonely kid standing at the funeral that everything would eventually work out, that all this pain and invisibility would somehow make sense one day. But maybe that's not how life works. Sometimes you have to walk through the fire to find out what you're really made of, and boy, was there fire ahead. You know how they say the darkest hour is just before dawn? Well, my darkest hour came when I was 15, and let me tell you, there wasn't any dawn in sight. It started with a phone call. I was in my cramped room trying to study for my AP chemistry exam when I heard Emma's hysterical crying downstairs. At first I ignored it. Drama was her specialty after all. But then I heard my mother's shocked gasp and my father's heavy footsteps pacing the living room. We quote, "I'll figure this out, sweetheart." Mom's voice drifted up. "Everything will be okay." I didn't know it then, but those words were about to turn my world upside down. Emma was pregnant at 15. The father, some 19-year-old community college dropout named Tyler, who worked part-time at the local GameStop. He had a neck tattoo that said, "Only God can judge me," and drove a souped-up Honda Civic that sounded like it was perpetually dying. Real Prince Charming material. Now you'd think finding out your 15-year-old daughter was pregnant would be cause for concern, right? Maybe some serious discussions about consequences, responsibility, and the challenges ahead? Nope, not in my family. Instead, it was like Emma had announced she'd won a Nobel Prize. "Oh, comma, sweetie, we're going to be grandparents." Mom squealed, while Dad started talking about converting the spare room into a nursery. They were acting like this was the most natural thing in the world. Like teenage pregnancy was just another achievement to add to Emma's growing list of ways to be the center of attention. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Tyler was suddenly a frequent guest at our dinner table, my parents overlooking his complete lack of ambition or basic table manners because he was now part of their precious Emma's story. They even helped him get a slightly better paying job at my uncle's warehouse, though he managed to show up late most days. Then came the shotgun wedding. Yes, you heard that right. My parents threw together a wedding for my 15-year-old sister like they were arranging a sweet 16 party. The ceremony was in our backyard, with Emma in a white dress that barely hid her growing belly and Tyler in a rented tux that still had the price tags hidden under the collar. I stood in the back, wondering if I was the only one who saw how insane this all was. But the real bomb dropped a week after the wedding. I was doing homework when Mom called me downstairs. She had that smile on her face, you know, the one that makes your stomach drop because you know whatever's coming next is going to be awful. "Jake, honey," she started, her voice syrupy sweet. "We need to talk about some changes around here." I knew what was coming before she even said it. Somehow I just knew, with Emma's baby on the way, we need more space. Your room would make the perfect nursery. I sat there staring at her, waiting for the punchline. But it wasn't a joke. They wanted my room, the one place in this house that was actually mine, even if it was just a converted storage space for Emma's baby. When I asked where I was supposed to go, Mom just shrugged like she was telling me we were out of milk. "You quote, re-getting older now," Dad chimed in from his recliner, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "Time to start thinking about making your own way in the world. Making my own way in the world. At 15. Because their pregnant teenage daughter needed my room for her baby." I tried to argue, to point out how insane this was. "I'm 15. Where am I supposed to go?" "Don't be dramatic, Jake," Mom sighed. "You'll figure something out. Emma needs us right now. And Emma?" She just stood there, one hand on her barely showing belly, with this look on her face like she was the star of some teen drama series. "Thanks, Jake," she said, already planning where to put the crib. "You're the best brother ever." That night, I lay in my bed, well, what used to be my bed, staring at the ceiling, Grandpa Marcus's words echoing in my head. "You're made of stronger stuff than they know, kid." I hoped he was right, because I was about to find out exactly what I was made of. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that night, was the beginning of the hardest chapter of my life. But sometimes when everything's being taken away from you, that's when you find out what you're really capable of. Looking back now, I almost want to thank them. Almost. Because what they did next, it didn't break me. It made me who I am today. But getting there, that was one hell of a journey. They say necessity is the mother of invention. In my case, necessity became the mother of survival. With nowhere else to go, I borrowed our old camping tent from the garage and set it up in the furthest corner of our backyard, hidden behind Mom's prized hydrangea bushes. Not exactly the teenage dream, but it was either that or the streets. Minnesota winters are brutal. Anyone who's lived through one will tell you that. But experiencing it from a tent? That's a whole different level of hell. The first few nights weren't too bad. It was still early autumn and the temperature was bearable. I'd lie there at night, listening to the sounds of my family inside the house. The clinking of dishes, laughter during dinner, the TV running late into the evening. It was like watching a life I used to be part of through a frosted window. I tried to keep up with school. I really did. Do you know how hard it is to do calculus homework by flashlight while wearing 3 layers of clothes? Or try to write an English essay when your fingers are so cold you can barely hold a pen? My grades started slipping, but of course nobody noticed. They were too busy converting my old room into what Emma called her dream nursery. The real challenge came when winter hit. Have you ever felt a cold so deep it seems to settle in your bones? The kind that makes you wonder if you'll ever feel warm again? That became my constant companion. I'd wake up with frost on my sleeping bag, my breath a cloud in the darkness. The tent wasn't meant for winter camping, and no matter how many blankets I piled on, the cold found its way in. To survive, I had to get creative. I started taking longer routes to school, stopping at the library when it opened at 7 a.m. to warm up and clean up in the bathroom. The librarian, Mrs. Peterson, must have suspected something was wrong, but she never asked. She just started leaving the heat on higher in the study area, where I usually sat, and occasionally forgetting her lunch bag with an extra sandwich on my table. I picked up odd jobs wherever I could, shooting driveways, walking dogs, anything to earn a few bucks. Most of the money went to food since I couldn't exactly walk into the house and raid the fridge anymore. I became a regular at the dollar store, mastering the art of making $5 stretch into something resembling meals. The worst part wasn't even the cold or the hunger. It was watching through the kitchen window as my family lived their lives like I had never existed. Emma would waddle around, showing off her growing belly while Mom and Dad fawned over her. They'd have family dinners and make plans for the baby, all while their other child was literally freezing in the backyard. One particularly cold night in January, when the temperature dropped to -20, I thought I might actually die. I couldn't feel my toes, and no matter how tightly I curled up, I couldn't stop shaking. That's when I broke down and walked to the 24-hour laundromat 6 blocks away. I spent the night there, pretending to be doing laundry while actually just soaking in the warmth from the dryers. The owner, an old Vietnamese man named Mr. Nguyen, saw right through me but just nodded and turned up the heat. "Sometimes," he said in his heavily accented English, pushing a cup of instant coffee into my hands, "family is not blood. Family is who helps when no one else will." I started spending more nights at the laundromat after that. Mr. Nguyen never charged me for staying, and sometimes he'd leave the TV on, by accident, so I could watch late-night shows. He even gave me a job cleaning the place in the early mornings before school. During this time, I learned something about people. There are those who see you and those who choose not to. My own family chose not to see me, but strangers like Mrs. Peterson and Mr. Nguyen, they saw me and showed more kindness than my own blood ever had. The tent became more of a storage space than a living space. I'd rotate between the laundromat, the school gym, I'd sneak in early, pretending to be there for morning practice, and the public library. I became a ghost, drifting between warm spaces, trying to piece together something resembling a life. One morning, as I was cleaning the laundromat windows, Mr. Nguyen approached me with a serious look on his face. "Jake," he said, "my daughter left for college. Her room is empty. It's not much, but..." I almost broke down right there, the window cleaner dripping down my arm. But I couldn't accept. I knew if my parents found out, they'd probably try to cause trouble for him, and I couldn't let another person suffer because of my situation. So I thanked him but declined, telling him I had a plan. I didn't, not really, but something in me had changed during those cold months. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was getting angry. And that anger? It was about to become the fuel that would change my life forever. Spring was coming, and with it, an opportunity I never saw coming. Sometimes rock bottom has a basement, but sometimes it also has a ladder. Mine came in the form of a help wanted sign in a window downtown and a chance encounter that would change everything. But that's the thing about hitting rock bottom. The only way left to go is up, and I was about to start climbing. That help wanted sign I mentioned? It was in the window of Miller's Bakery, this old school place that had been downtown since forever. I must have walked past it 100 times during my wanderings, always catching the scent of fresh bread, but never giving it much thought. But that spring morning, something made me stop. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was destiny. Or maybe it was just that I hadn't eaten anything but dollar store crackers in 2 days. Whatever it was, I found myself pushing open that door, the little bell above it announcing my presence like it was heralding a new chapter in my life. That's where I met Rick Miller. Picture a guy in his 50s, built like a retired linebacker, with flour perpetually dusting his arms and a permanent scowl that could curdle milk. He took one look at me, this skinny, probably smelly teenager in threadbare clothes, and I thought for sure he was going to tell me to get lost. Instead, he asked, "You know how to mop?" Just like that. I had a job. The work was hard, harder than anything I'd done before. Rick ran his bakery like a military operation, and his standards were higher than Mount Everest. I had to be there at 4 a.m. every morning, no exceptions. The floors had to be spotless, the windows gleaming, and the display cases so clean you could perform surgery on them. But you know what? I loved every second of it. For the first time in my life, someone was actually seeing my work, acknowledging my effort. Sure, Rick's idea of praise was mostly just grunts and nods, but each one felt like a gold medal to me. The best part? The bakery was warm. After months of freezing in that tent, the heat from the ovens felt like heaven. Rick never commented when I'd linger near them during my breaks, just silently pushed a day-old Danish my way and went back to his baking. Over time, I started learning more than just how to clean. Rick would bark out instructions, "Watch this dough, kid," or "Pay attention to how I'm folding these croissants." And gradually, I began picking up the basics of baking. There was something therapeutic about it. The precision required, the way you had to be patient and let things develop in their own time. One day, after I'd been there for about 6 months, Rick caught me practicing with some leftover dough during my break. Instead of getting mad about wasted ingredients, he just watched for a minute, then said, "Your technique's all wrong. Here, let me show you. That was the beginning of my real education." Rick, it turned out, had been a professional baker for over 30 years. He'd trained in France, worked in some of the best bakeries in New York, and eventually came back to Minnesota to open his own place. And for some reason I still don't fully understand, he decided to teach me everything he knew. The more I learned, the more hours Rick gave me. Soon I was working almost full-time, going to school during the day and baking at night. My grades were still suffering, but I was learning something more valuable, a trade, a skill, something that could actually give me a future. Then came the day that changed everything. I was closing up the shop when Rick handed me a set of keys. "Storage room upstairs," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Previous tenant moved out. It's not much, but it's got a bed and a bathroom. Rent's $200 a month, taken out of your paycheck." I stood there, keys in hand, probably looking like an idiot. Rick just waved me off. "Don't make it weird, kid. Just keep the place clean and don't make me regret it." That night, for the first time in almost a year, I slept in a real bed. The room was tiny, barely bigger than my old closet-sized bedroom, but it was mine. I had a roof over my head, a job I loved, and a mentor who, in his own gruff way, actually cared about my future. I threw myself into learning everything I could about baking. Rick taught me about different types of flour, the chemistry behind fermentation, and how to develop the perfect crust on a baguette. I learned that baking was as much science as art, and I was good at both. By the time I turned 17, I was basically running the front of the shop while Rick handled the baking. We made a good team. Him with his decades of experience and me with my eagerness to learn everything I could. The customers seemed to like me, and business was steady. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One morning, Rick didn't show up for work. No call, no message, nothing. It wasn't like him at all. After 2 hours of waiting, I used the spare key he'd given me and opened up anyway. We had orders to fill, and I knew enough by then to handle the basic morning bake. When he finally showed up around noon, something was off. His face was pale, and he looked older somehow, more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Cancer," he said without preamble, dropping into a chair. "Stage 3, pancreatic. Those words hit me like a physical blow. It felt like losing Grandpa Marcus all over again. But this time, I wasn't that helpless kid anymore. This time, I could actually do something. "What do you need?" I asked, already rolling up my sleeves. Rick looked at me for a long moment, then smiled, the first real smile I'd ever seen from him. "Think you can handle the morning bake on your own for a while?" It wasn't really a question. We both knew I could. What neither of us knew was just how much a while would turn out to be, or how this twist of fate would lead to the next chapter of my life, one that would finally bring me face to face with my past. But first, I had a bakery to run and a mentor to support. Sometimes life's greatest opportunities come disguised as challenges, and I was about to face one of my biggest yet. Life has a way of coming full circle. By the time I turned 25, I owned Miller's Bakery. Not because I bought it. Rick left it to me in his will. "You're the only one who'll love it as much as I did," his lawyer read from the letter. I stood there in that office fighting back tears, remembering the gruff man who'd saved my life and given me a future. Rick had fought hard, lasting almost 3 years after his diagnosis. During that time, he taught me everything he could about running the business. Not just the baking, but the books, the suppliers, all of it. When he finally passed, I wasn't just losing a mentor. I was losing the closest thing to a father I'd ever really had. The bakery thrived under my care. I expanded our menu, added a coffee shop section, and even started catering for local businesses. By 28, I had enough saved to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood across town. Nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a small yard, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every paint color, every fixture was something I chose. No hand-me-downs, no leftovers, just my choices, my space, my life. I thought I'd finally closed the book on my past. I hadn't seen my family in years, though I'd heard bits and pieces through the town grapevine. Emma had 2 more kids with Tyler, who still worked at the warehouse. My parents had downsized to a smaller house after Dad took early retirement. Life had gone on for them, just as it had for me. Then came the knock on my door. It was a Sunday afternoon in June. I was in my kitchen, testing a new sourdough recipe, when I heard it. Opening the door, I felt like I'd stepped into some bizarre time warp. There they were, Mom, Dad, Emma, Tyler, and their 3 kids, all standing on my porch like some twisted family portrait. Mom looked older, more gray than I remembered. Dad had lost weight. His formerly imposing frame is now almost frail. Emma looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from having 3 kids before you're 25. Tyler stood behind them, still sporting that ridiculous neck tattoo, now faded and stretching with age. "Jake," Mom said, attempting a smile. "You have such a lovely home. The surreal nature of it all almost made me laugh. After 13 years, that's what she opens with? A comment about my house? What do you want?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. That's when the truth came out. Emma and Tyler had lost their rental. Dad's early retirement hadn't been entirely voluntary, and their savings were drained. They'd heard through the grapevine about my success, about my house, and they'd come with a proposition. "We thought," Mom said, her voice sticky sweet like it used to be when she wanted something. "Maybe we could all live together, like a proper family." I stood there frozen as Emma chimed in. "It would be perfect, Jake. The kids could have their own rooms and we could all help with expenses. That quote S when something inside me snapped, not in anger but in clarity. I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw them for what they were, strangers. Strangers who shared my DNA but had never shared my life. "No," I said simply. "But we're family," Mom protested, like she was reading from an old script. "Family." I couldn't help but laugh. Where was family when I was sleeping in a tent at 15? Where was family when I was working 2 jobs to survive? Where was family when I needed you? They had the decency to look uncomfortable at least. Dad started to say something about the past being the past, but I cut him off. "The past isn't just the past. It's what shaped me. It's what made me who I am. And who I am is someone who doesn't need you anymore." That quote S when Emma, ever the dramatist, played her last card. "But the children." "Stop," I said firmly. "Your children are not my responsibility. Just like I wasn't yours when you took my room. Just like I wasn't Mom and Dad's when they threw me out. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them." I could see the moment it hit them, the realization that their safety net, their backup plan, wasn't going to materialize. The entitled expectation in their eyes turned to desperation. "But where are we supposed to go?" Mom asked, her voice small. I thought about Rick then, about how he'd given me a chance when I needed it most, about how he'd taught me not just about baking, but about dignity, about work ethic, about being a decent human being. There's a shelter on 4th Street, I said. They have family units available. They also have job training programs and counseling services. They can help you get back on your feet if you're willing to do the work. I gave them the address, then closed the door. Through the window, I watched them walk back to their car, shoulders slumped, looking lost. Part of me felt guilty, that old programming trying to make me responsible for their happiness. But a stronger part knew I'd done the right thing. That night, I went up to my bakery office and pulled out an old photo, the only one I had of Rick and me together, taken about a month before he passed. We were standing in front of the ovens, both covered in flour, him with his usual scowl, me grinning like an idiot. On the back, he'd written something I'd never noticed before. "Remember, kid, you can't rise if you're carrying too much weight." I smiled, running my fingers over his messy handwriting. He'd known somehow that this day would come, that I'd have to choose between rising higher and being dragged down. The next morning, I did what I always do. I got up at 4 a.m., turned on the ovens, and started baking. Because that's what Rick taught me. Life goes on, bread needs baking, and the only person responsible for your happiness is you. My family never came back after that day. I heard they eventually moved to another state, starting fresh somewhere else. Sometimes I wonder about them, but not often. I'm too busy living my life, running my bakery, mentoring young bakers, building my own kind of family. And you know what? I finally understand what Grandpa Marcus meant all those years ago about the best people coming from the worst situations. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you end up with. And sometimes, just sometimes, the kid sleeping in a tent behind his parents' house ends up owning his own bakery and living a life better than anything they could have given him. That's my story. Not a fairy tale, not a tragedy, just a story about learning to rise, about finding your own way, and about realizing that sometimes the best revenge isn't success. It's simply being happy without the people who thought you couldn't be happy without them.